Yeah, thanks for staying as long as you have, and I hope you'll stay for Benjamin's talk afterwards as well. I was really, really happy when like a massive herd of geeks came through the door to listen to the first talk in this room, because one of the things we pushed quite hard for when we were planning all of this was to have one place for more applied methodological work and one place for more kind of like football-centered, soft, rubbish stuff. So I'm really glad that some of you have lasted. And I'm aware that you're probably going through some sort of terrible sugar crash at the moment. But I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes and you'll be asleep at the end. I am indeed StatsBomb's chief data monkey, or CTO, to give me my more grandiose title. I'm responsible for the systems that run our analysis platform, StatsBomb IQ. I'm responsible for many of the bad decisions behind data, including all of the JSON that everybody's complained about today. I assure you there is a bug in our bug tracking system, which is make it easier for people who live in like flat data world. I can't claim that I will prioritize it after this, but just out of spite more than anything. But maybe at some point. I did briefly work for a summer at Slavia Prague doing sort of database recruitment. If you go and look on clubelo.com, you'll note that the time I joined was at the bottom of this massive rise, which ended in them in the quarterfinals of the Europa League. I can't really take credit for that. They were also bought by a Chinese conglomerate roughly at the same time. But that was very enjoyable. And yeah, I used to go by DeepXG on Twitter, and I used to blog lots of stupid, colourful polygons. But for reasons that I'm sure you'll understand after this talk, I don't really like XG much. And so I didn't want that to be my name anymore. Anyway, let's get some energy in the room.
Everybody in the audience, now listen to me carefully, is being given a special package, and I don't want you to open it. Do not open it. Cameras are on you, so do not open it until I tell you. All right, open your boxes. Open your boxes. 1, 2, 3.
Don't
You get a car! 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 Everybody gets a car!
Okay, nobody gets a car. But I don't know if you've got them yet. I don't know if you've been given like little swag bags or you've got them from downstairs, but literally everybody's going to get a USB stick which has all of our EPL 2017-2018 data. I am not the one responsible for the fact that the file is called statsbomb.zip.zip. But I believe if you click enough times, it'll open. It was just there's a lot of data and we were trying to make it smaller and smaller, and you know. And also, by all means, go on. We've always on GitHub. We've tried to maintain this open data we collect. The FA Women's Super League. We've got both men's and women's World Cup data up there, and this crazy, messy project we did, which will actually be completed soon, where we've gone back and we've collected every single messy game in history. So by all means, play with that, and please do grab Thom's project that he mentioned. It sounds like you can just download all of this into that, and you will have an EPV model straight away. So I'm quite excited about that. So I'm hoping after this conference I don't have to see arguments about XG on Twitter anymore. It's all going to be EPV arguments and the value of a single pass and stuff like that. Anyway, all of the clever stuff that you see today is the responsibility of this guy, Derek Yam. We hired Derek out of Brown in America to be a data scientist. He stayed with us for a year. He worked on a lot of the early XG modeling that we did with freeze frames, and worked out a lot of the features that were important to capture some of the defensive pressure and the sight on goal stuff that we've done. He also worked on our goalkeeper metrics and created the first version of the goalkeeper module in our analysis platform. He since got poached at the start of the summer, which, as you'll see, has put a bit of a spanner in the works of some of the models I'm going to talk about. He now works for the Baltimore Ravens in NFL. They're tearing it up, doing all sorts of weird analytics-based NFL stuff. If that's a career progression that sounds interesting to anyone in this room, we're hiring. And so please, some of you have, send CVs to careers@statsbomb.com. We've got data science openings. We've got basically anything that you want to do if you're smart. Just send us an email and we'll sort you out, but probably not this week, because Ted put it on Twitter and I've got about 100 CVs in my inbox. That's my life for the next few years. Anyway, we finally killed XG. We've got something else to talk about. So that's good. So when we planned this, I don't know if it was a subconscious thing. I don't think we were consciously trying to make every single talk about EPV frameworks or expected threat, but I'm kind of glad that that's happened, because again, I would just like never to have to listen to another argument about XG. I don't think XG helps you analyse football in any particular way other than shoot closer to the goal. And what I'm really, really hoping from this talk is that, as I say, people go away perhaps using this sort of off-the-shelf EPV model, or they build their own, or let's just aim for something slightly better, slightly more complex, and talk about the 90% of football that never gets talked about on Twitter, at least. Behind closed doors, do what you like. I don't care. So this talk is kind of about our journey doing just that. And I'm going to talk about the kinds of EPV-ish models that we've been trying to build. I'm going to talk about, frankly, the ways in which that we have failed to do that on repeated occasions and the lessons that we've learned. I think there are a lot of, there are some slightly subtle but important points that people don't perhaps think about with these models. Yeah, and hopefully that the fact that we flailed about doing 5 different versions of this in order might give you some inspiration to do it yourself, because, you know, not to claim that we're the big boys, but even the big boys can fail. I mean, I am a big boy, but... right, expected possession value. Does anyone not know what it is yet? Okay, you've heard it about 15 times. Probability of a goal within this possession. It's obviously a fantastic model in terms of communication, because it's really, really clear what it means. It feeds into predictive models in the way that XG would, but slightly better because it captures more play. And yeah, we've seen Thom talking about how you might take 2 of these models, you might compare them and decide which is the most accurate. Probably the state of the art, as we've just heard mention of, is this. Is Javi in here? No, good. So yeah, this is the Javier Fernandez Leaderboard EPV paper. This is all based on tracking data and really, really smart stuff. This is about as good as you can do in terms of EPV. And so the kind of models that we're talking about give you this very continuous scale of goal threat one way or the other. And one of the nice things about this is it captures obviously both the attacking data and the defensive data. Now, as I say, these are the smartest guys in the industry. What I question is, in this whole passage of play, let me play it again, the highest amplitude EPV value is at this moment, down here. This pass across field here, that is a 10% chance of an immediate turnover and attack on goal ending in a goal. And now you might agree that the defence are out of place, but it seems very weird to me that that number is the highest probability that you get out of this whole sequence with, you know, Messi running up the pitch and the ball going in the box and stuff. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not really qualified as a football person to do that. But I think, just to go back to Tom's point, it's like, would you bet the farm on these kinds of models? And how might you validate them in a way that actually makes football sense? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think there are maybe some more fundamental issues with EPV, the way that I see it, that are kind of philosophical. The definition of possession is very, very loose. I don't think anybody has agreed on a standard definition for what a possession is across all of football, because in some models you don't want to split on every single tackle. You want to pick up things like second balls. The ball goes into the box, someone heads it out, you pick it up. The defence is pretty much in the same sort of the same setup as they were before the cross. You've got the same level of attacking momentum that you had before. So in terms of modelling, you probably want to persist across that. But there are a lot of models of possessions that will split there. I think Opta's is a little bit too eager, if I'm honest. To solve that problem, some people will then sort of choose a sort of arbitrary horizon of next 10 events, next 10 seconds, which is a slightly more fluid way of doing it, and you don't have the problems that you're bumping up against turnovers. But the issue that you have is that you miss things off the end of that horizon. So you might make an absolutely amazing pass in the centre of the field. You might make a counter-attack that goes up the other end. It might result in a corner. Now, what's the value of that corner? The corner comes in, it headed out, and in the second phase, maybe you score a goal. That's way beyond the horizon of how you can value the action that you initially took at the start of that attacking move. And so making sort of semi-arbitrary cut-offs, I find a little bit icky because I think you're just probably missing some signal. And there's already a paucity of signal in all of these models based around goals, because there just aren't enough goals, there aren't enough shots. We've actually had some good work around this today. The risk of conceding is not always explicit in these models. They're often, this is the attacking value. And we've seen from the Opta model announced last week and the previous talk to this one, you can actually capture that to an extent in terms of turnovers, the risk of a turnover and the value of a turnover. So obviously if you give the ball away near your goal, that's a really high value negative event. If you give the ball away further up the pitch, that's a lower value negative event. But again, we can sort of capture that. But the issue that you have there is that you're not so much capturing your risk of conceding while you're on the ball. And quite often, there are game states where what you care about is minimizing the chance of conceding, but not caring at all about scoring. And you can do that by keeping the ball. Now, as I say, we mentioned that in the last talk, but a lot of models miss this. Now also, some of these models miss some of the most awesome plays in football, including this one. Oops! Who's kicked it out? I fell in love with this kickoff. This was big in France for a year for some reason. Because I think this is like a really good test of your model, is whether it understands what the hell is going on here. Because so this is a slightly weird play. This isn't like match fixing. This isn't like all of the players have bet on the minute of the first throw-in. This is like legit tactics that somebody has thought up. And now obviously, what people are thinking when they make this play is that an opponent throw-in the corner of the pitch is worth more to me than established possession in the centre of the pitch. Now that might be a controversial thing to say. You might not agree, but in a lot of models, this isn't something that you can capture, because the moment that ball goes out for a throw-in, your EPV drops to 0, and that's it. So that guy is never going to look like a smart player making that move. That team is always going to look stupid because your EPV model thinks that this is absolutely pointless. Now, I went through loads of these. I couldn't actually find one where what you want to happen happens. What you want to happen is that you press them really aggressively, and they take the throw-in, and you win it back and you score. But frankly, this is not the only one to find with a shot, and it's not for the right team. But here we go, we've got the high press, we're going to get the ball back, we're going to counter-attack, we're going to score. We're geniuses, we've broken tactics. Oh no, oops. It's not good. Now, hilariously, for a talk about EPV, this guy needs to know a little bit more about XG. That's a terrible, terrible shot. But, so anyway, I don't know what the actual value of this. I remember looking at it once, and I remember thinking that if the ball went further than like about 18 yards out, then it probably was a positive play. But my point is, we need to be able to capture stuff like this. And obviously, this is an extreme, slightly degenerate case. But this comes up time and time again in all sorts of tactics where you accrue some value, and that might even just be kicking the ball into the corner and letting their left back pick it up. But you haven't given away all of the value that you've accrued there, because you might then go press, you might then win it back. This might be a deliberate strategy that happens in open play as well as in set plays. And unless you've got a model that captures that, then I don't think you're capturing everything about football. And that's kind of what we should aim for in analytics. And so what you really need to do is extend the horizon even further. Not 10 events, not 20 events, Not 10 minutes, as Thom pointed out, but there is no cutoff where you can say that the value that you've been accruing through your build-up play becomes irrelevant. And how do we capture that? And so I want to talk a bit about reinforcement learning. Now, I may be misunderstanding Karun's talk, but effectively, a lot of these Markov models are Markov decision processes, which are you have the game in a certain state, there is a chance that it will move to another state, and there's a chance from there that it will move to another state. And what you can do is you can project from the future the value of those plays back into the past. Now, 8 years ago, Sarah Rudd, who eventually went to Arsenal, did what is the only provably correct model that you're going to see today. And I say that because in 2011, she had Tim Cahill there as the most valuable player in the Premier League. And as an Everton fan, I know for a fact that that's true. So effectively, what these models give you is like delayed gratification, which isn't something that I'm particularly familiar with. But you can't set the horizon on where the reward will happen for the good play that you've put in. And so one of the things that we've explored is how can you get away from this idea of stopping play at turnovers, and how can you get away from this idea of arbitrary windows? And also, just while we're on it, so this little girl staring at the sweetie there, this is like one of the famous results from psychology, which is that the kids who are told you don't eat that sweetie, and then you go out of the room and you come back and you find out they've eaten it. The kids that do eat it were supposed to have like worse life outcomes than the ones that don't. But this has been one of the victims of the great replication crisis in psychology recently. So eat the marshmallow. Have some fun. So yeah. So one of the things we started looking at was a thing called Q learning, which is this has been sort of a hot topic for a few years now. It's the thing behind all of the cool stuff that DeepMind have done recently. And again, it's this idea that there's a reward somewhere in the future, and you're projecting it back into the past so that you can evaluate the decisions that you take. And so one of the cool demos, this is one of the early demos they did. Does this work? No, give me my video. Oh, I really, really want to show you my Pac-Man video, but I don't think I'm going to be able to. Oh, here we go. Yeah, there we go. So this is DeepMind learning to play Pac-Man. And I think Pac-Man is actually, you might not know this, but it's probably the closest that you can get to simulating the new goal kick rules. So basically, you've got Pac-Man here is like a defender trying to escape the press, and he's escaping these defenders. Occasionally, he'll bite one of these flashing performance-enhancing sweeties, and he'll go back and kill the defenders. But yeah, effectively, it's getting better and better at playing this game. And then eventually it basically finds an optimal strategy and never loses. So obviously this isn't football, but what Q-learning basically is you take as input whatever state you're interested in. In most of these cases, it's just looking at all of the pixels on the screen. And you give it something to optimize, which in this case is the score. And then you tell it, this is the set of actions that you can take. Now, Pac-Man isn't quite as complex as football. You can go up, down, left, and right. If football was that simple, then we probably would have solved it. But what Q-learning eventually does is it learns in every single state which action will reward it optimally. And then it basically, and they've perfected Pac-Man, they've broken chess, they've ruined basically everything that was good in the world. And they'll eventually take your jobs. So anyway, you can't use any of this because they've patented it in the US because the patent system is stupid. But how can we apply that to football? Yeah, well, we can't. So players aren't robots. And that FIFA have lots of rules about putting electrodes in players' brains and controlling them like marionettes. So yeah, we're not able to do this kind of learning where we look at the score of the game or the outcome of the game, we control the players completely, and we work out what the optimal strategy to solve football is. Because even if, as René Maric has done, even if you can distill down the choices that you have as a player in football. And he says that they basically, from a training point of view, they basically distill it down to 8 different decisions. Even if you can do that, those decisions iterated across the whole field, iterated across, I'm going to pass over there, I'm going to pass over there, and all the different states. You can't really reduce the space that much. Google do actually have a library that is a reasonably realistic physical simulation of football. And so you can actually write your own software agents that go into that world and interact and then come up with their own tactics, and you can basically run 1 million matches against each other. And eventually you'll learn an optimal strategy for a version of football that has absolutely no bearing on the real world. But you might be able to win Football Manager that way, I don't know. But anyway, so pending further future degeneration of the game, we're not going to be able to control the players. But what we can do is this thing called SARSA. Now, there are different types of reinforcement learning. Some will try and explore the world and try and find the optimal strategy, whereas some will operate on the strategy that already exists. Now, if we posit that all defenders in the world are effectively playing the game of Pac-Man the same way, they have learned a sort of general strategy over all players, then what we can do is we can use this algorithm to use the same rewards mechanism that Q-learning uses to project all of this future value back in time. But we don't have to worry about controlling them, because all we're doing is we're saying, well, they're going to behave the same way. A player who receives the ball in the box is roughly going to behave the same way as another player. And so what that gives us is an iterative process to take rewards from the future, i.e. goals, or maybe XG, and project them back using this complicated equation, which, as the only person without a PhD or is a PhD student on the stage today, I won't explain, but Q is effectively the value function. You can iteratively take the rewards from the future and project them backwards. Now, an interesting thing you could do with this is that you can assume that different teams are actually different, and you can tailor it to different specific team strategies. So obviously, if you're doing some build-up play, it makes a big difference if Raheem Sterling is at the end of the move over, Gylfi Sigurdsson or someone like that. So you could potentially train this per team, but to be honest, for sample size, what we've done is we've basically just chucked all the data at it, because that's the kind of people we are. So all this is effectively doing is, in a sort of slightly weighted, slow way, it's saying, I know there's a goal next. That means the event before a goal is eventually going to learn that it's quite valuable, which means the event before that is eventually going to learn that it's quite valuable, and back and back and back. Now, obviously, this is being trained alongside all events in the data set. So it's not just that every pass that leads to a goal suddenly looks good in this system. But an advantage, we went and built a massive neural network that trains very slowly, but you can actually do this with anything. You could even do just a linear regression or something that takes these rewards, trains against them, updates the rewards for everything else, and then trains again. I'm just going to give you a very quick example of how that process works. This is tackle in the middle of the field. You pass, there's a carry, and then a through ball, and then a shot, and then a goal. This is as simple as it gets. So this is what the process looks like to actually train this model with this thing called SARSA. So we start off with the data, and we assign rewards to things. Now, to begin with, we only care about, does this work? Yeah, goals. So we set goals to 1. Now, if you want to save some time, you can just set shots to their XG values. But if you actually use rich enough data, like if you use your whole data set, we don't currently use freeze frames in this, so we probably would do better with XG. But it will effectively learn the XG values of shots, and that's actually one way that you can validate this sort of model. But what you're going to do is you're going to go into this cycle of training a model, and again, you can do any sort of model that you like on this data to learn to predict that. So we know goals are always 1. And to begin with, nothing else has any value at all. And so we go train, and then we predict after that training. We do the SARSA update, which then basically takes this value, projects a little bit, not too much, just a little slither of value backwards, and then trains again. So suddenly the model is starting to learn that shots are valuable. And then we train again, and we predict again, and we get new values that take into account the new information, and then we update, and we train, and we predict. And you basically leave this running on AWS until it bankrupts the company. Or you leave it running on the GPU on your laptop until your laptop sets on fire. Or, alternatively, eventually the numbers converge and you actually get a usable model out. But what you'll see over time is that we learn that shots are valuable because they lead to goals. We learn that certain types of passes are valuable because they lead to shots that lead to goals. We learn that tackles are valuable because they lead to passes that lead to... And what this means is that you can train a similar model to the kind of Markov models that we've seen, but it frees you in a way from splitting things into zones or clustering them. We can just do it on the raw data. And what that means is that every individual event is getting its own value in the data set. So we get very, very granular numbers out. As I say, we built this in a massive neural network. It's not really complicated. You'll be able to find somewhere to cut and paste code like this. I would suggest, if any of this sounds intimidating to you, that you do the Fast AI course. It's kind of, it's focused at people with a little bit of programming experience as opposed to AI researchers. It's incredibly friendly. It's run by two very, very nice people. And I've tried not to make all the diagrams too complicated, if only because PowerPoint's like little word art thing still doesn't do neural networks, so I've only got arrows instead of fully connected, dense neural network layers. Anyway, so there's a couple of things about the way we structured this model that make it interesting. The first is the way that we deal with input. Over on the left, this blue layer in the neural network is called an LSTM layer, which stands for long short-term memory. What that basically does is allow you to feed in, instead of just a big blob of data, and instead of just concatenating some events together into a big blob of data, you can feed in a sequence. And what the LSTM will learn is some of the temporal information in that sequence. It will learn that I've just been passed to, and it looks like a through ball. And that's better than if I had been passed to, and it was a cross or something like that. Because obviously we know that football has a huge amount of context that we don't necessarily have in event data, that we maybe have in tracking data, so you probably don't need all of this. But the build-up play massively, massively affects the way that you would judge the event that you're talking about. So we feed in 10 events into this LSTM, and then we sort of push it through all these neural network layers. And then the other interesting thing about the model is what we do at the end. Now, instead of just thinking, well, what is the chance of a goal in this possession, within 10 events, within 10 seconds, what we're training on is the probability that the home team scores next, that the away team scores next, or that nobody scores next. And it doesn't matter when that happens. So effectively, however long the horizon is, this model eventually learns what kind of play builds up to goals without any interference in the middle. Now, that's only really true if you have infinite computing power. So I've trained this for a little while. These numbers get better the more iterations you do, but you don't have infinite time. But this is effectively what a game looks like once you have trained on these values and then predicted on them. So this is what a game looks like. The blue curve is the home team. The red curve is the away team. And the yellow curve is boring. There's not going to be any more goals. Now, obviously, you can see that there are big spikes here, which are, if they reach all the way to the top, that's a goal. I suspect, is that red one a missed penalty? Effectively, all of the spikes are shots, which makes me sad, because we're trying to get away from shots, and we're trying to learn more about the game. And also, you'll notice there is a very strong and ultimately correct home team bias here. So the home team is pretty much always ahead, except for when the away team are shooting. There's an argument to be made that you shouldn't structure it this way, and that's something that I'm experimenting with at the moment. Ultimately, one of the things that we would love to answer in football analytics is what is the actual mechanism of home advantage? Like, what types of things do teams do that makes home teams better than away teams? And so if you kind of like just put it in the model, then you kind of lose the ability to do that. So that might not be desirable. But so yeah, effectively that's what a game looks like in terms of probabilities. You can see really big swings. Obviously, there's this massive one. It looks like the game's going, and then suddenly there's a good shot at the end. There's a goal at the end, in fact, which means that the who scores next suddenly drops down out of nowhere. Now, as I say, the more training time you do this, the out of nowhere part is reduced a little bit, but not much. And there are times that I worry that almost all football is kind of within the margins of errors, and like all that matters is shots and things, and that just makes me so depressed I could quit. But no. So anyway, who scores next? Yeah, as I say, I mean, like these things are good to see because it's obviously capturing something that's true in the world. It's capturing home advantage. It's capturing the base rate of 0-0 draws. If you look, it starts off at about 5 to 7%, which is literally at the start of the game. That's the probability of a 0-0 draw. You have issues with this. Obviously, it's pretty concrete in terms of EPV, what the player values are. You know, you have contributed to things that are more or less goals, and you can explain that. I don't really know what 1.0 who scored next is, but it's good to have. So anyway, if you like, you can normalize out the no score. It is useful in and of itself because obviously that sometimes you are playing, you don't care about this blue line. What you care about is this red line going down and this line going up. You know, you're 2-0 up. You maybe don't want to score. I do believe that attacking play is probably the best way to defend, but who knows? But there are cases in which you will discover events in the database that minimize this number and maximize this plus this. So already, this is a model that sort of opens up slightly more strategizing at the event level. If you normalize out that no score curve, and I've taken out home and away advantage here, you do get a lot of nice overlaps. The problem that you have is that towards the end, you get wildly, wildly weird peaks and troughs. And the reason is that in the output layer of the neural network, obviously all of the signal is going to, well, the game's going to end, it's all over, I don't care about all these values. And then there's just a lot of variance at the end. Now, this is arguably one of the places in which we've tried something really, really clever and ended up with something that might not be useful because I don't want to throw away the last 10 minutes of every game. I don't want to lose 10% of every player's minutes just because I can't trust those. But other than that, this is a reasonably cool model. It does something cool, it does something new. If you throw enough money at it, you eventually get quite a nicely fitted model and you get, you know, all of your EPV values out without having to worry that you've cut off in the middle of a sequence and you know that it's capturing temporal information and stuff like that. But that's an easy claim to make. How might you verify this model? Now, we've talked about earlier, we've talked about the validation methods that you can use for these models. We've talked about how you might compare one model to another. What do you do if you're trying something completely wacky and you've got a complex model, you've checked that Messi's at the top, but what do you compare it to? This hasn't come out of a Kaggle competition, so there's no leaderboard for you to know whether it's a good or a bad model. Nobody else has really done one of these, but I encourage you to, please. Then you can compare your accuracy. You know that there aren't really that many outputs where you can say, yes, that's the right number. Like penalties is probably the closest that you can get to. You know penalties are roughly like 75, 80% chances. But we already knew that from XG. So let's do a little test. Right, hands up, anyone in the air who considers, anyone in the room who considers themselves a professional software developer of any sort. Do you program Python or R and get paid for it? There we go. Don't be embarrassed. Be proud. Okay, right. Keep your hand up. No, keep them up, keep them up. Keep your hand up if you have ever written a unit test or an acceptance test. Really? Keep your hands up if you always write unit tests and acceptance tests. Whose hand is left up? Chris! Oh, we already hired you. I was literally going to make a job offer to anybody who left their hands up. Unfortunately, we've already hired Chris. Chris knows that I don't, so... basically, one of the things that we started moving towards is we don't know what the exact outputs for these models should be. But we do know vaguely the types of things that the model should be capturing. We can rule out certain values, but we can also say, all things being equal, this output should be more than that output, and this output should be less than that output. Obviously, the moment one of these tests fails, and you should build up a huge suite, and you should involve all of the analysts at your club, and you should involve people who know about football and say, that number is stupid for these reasons. When the model and your assumptions disagree, that's a conversation to have. At that point, you shouldn't throw the model away, you should think. Because there's a chance that you've just broken football. It's a small chance, there's more of a chance that there's a bug. But you should at least think when one of these fails. So just to give an example. Now obviously this is dead simple in terms of XG. So if you're shooting from the penalty area, one would expect the XG value to be higher than if you're shooting from out here. Now again, we know what the value here is, and we know what the value here is. Now obviously this falls down in terms of like goalkeeper positioning. So you actually have to set these up with some thought, but let's say the keeper's on the line or something. So we would always expect, all things being equal, no defenders in sight, keeper on the line. This has to be bigger XG than this. If it's not, then your model's doing something weird. And you can go away and prove that. You can go away and make a slightly more detailed, like inferential model, and you can have the argument, and at the end of it, you'll be wrong. But these are the sorts of tests that you should set up. But you can set up slightly more complicated ones. Now, I've since thought about this, and I'm not sure I actually agree with model outputs, but this is what it says. Okay, so, and this is from last year's data before the new goal kick rule and everybody losing their minds. So, keeper kicks it out, and then a pass forwards to around the halfway line. You put this into the model, and you say, well, what do you think? And it says, well, that adds about like 9% who scored nexts. So how should that compare to this? Now we think, like if you're drawing the opponent onto you and you're encouraging the press and then playing a successful pass through the press, that you should get a higher number. And we do, but it's a bit, I don't believe that this model is accurate to within 0.1%. At that point I realized that wasn't actually the question that we were asking, because in StatsBomb data, there's pressure data. And so what it's seeing here is where you're passing it around at the back and you're not being pressured. And then you're passing it forwards, and I know, because you're not being pressured, that actually the defense is all over there. So if you add in the pressure events, you get a slightly higher signal. Again, most play is within the margin of error. But you can build up huge suites of tests like this, and I encourage you to, which will basically allow you to automate the eye test. Now, obviously, what you don't want to do is train this model, put it in front of people, say, point out all the stupid things about this model, and then iterate, and then iterate, and then iterate. Every time you do that, every time you have, an analyst say, why the hell does it think that? I think we recently had an XG value. I mean, StatsBomb obviously never have any bugs, but we recently had an XG value that I think got put in the bucket with direct corners. It was right on the edge of the field, and it just had an insane value. Every time that happens, put a test in that says every time I retrain this model, every time I come up with a fruity new model of a different structure, rerun that test. And you will probably catch some bugs, and it sort of gives you a little bit more confidence outside of traditional statistical measures that you're not doing a stupid job. Stupid list of players, Lionel Messi's at the top, we win. So this brings me to like another of my bugbears, which is like, how do you take all the values out of one of these models and turn it into something useful for player identification? And like the answer for everybody is, well, we add up the deltas between events. Like I take a pass, there's a 49% chance of us scoring next. And then after the pass, there's a 49.5% chance. And so I've got a +5, plus 0.5. But the problem is you always get, at the end of this, you get Lionel Messi at the top because he's the GOAT, but then you get all these other attackers, and it's just a really boring list. And what you end up doing is you just like say, well, okay, well, this is the list of attackers, this is the list of attacking midfielders and centre midfielders, and that's great, but those roles are kind of interchangeable, and so you're putting people in buckets together, and you know that they've got different output values, and you're kind of smooshing the data together. So the thing that we realized is that the raw rewards don't actually capture what your options are on the ball. Different players in different parts of the field have access to slightly different looking rewards. I.e., like this. These aren't real curves, I've just drawn them. At the top end of the field, the steepness of that value curve goes way, way up. And the only players on the field who have access to those kinds of rewards are attackers. Now, obviously, a pass played around this side of the field is probably a bit harder. But there are going to be a lot of circumstances where you're playing a 5-yard pass forwards here, and you're getting access to all of these nice, green, juicy rewards, but somebody's playing exactly the same 5-yard pass and completing it over here, and they're not getting anything. They're stuck in this trough of meh. And this really affects like all sorts of different models, not just these, but if you're doing sort of mixed modelling with players, I think this is one of the reasons that you sometimes get funny values out of passing completion models as well, because different players have access to different levels of rewards, and it's the same's true on the risk side. As if you're a defender and you give the ball away, you do something stupid, you're going to be punished hugely, even though you might have the exact same skill on the ball as someone over here. They give the ball away, and it's all just meh. And these people, they realise at some point that they can look good in all of the models by making nothing but long passes forwards. When the passes are completed, they get access to this curve. When they're not, they're here. So if you're a DM and your club starts hiring lots of analysts and they use this stupid model without thinking about it, then just hit the ball forwards and you'll get a big juicy contract, and that's not what we want. So just to illustrate this is rather scary and foreboding. I thought this would look joyful, but it doesn't. It looks really, really weird. So a team of Messis. Oh, I'm going to flood that. No, good. Now, this team might not actually win any games. I'm not sure putting like a diminutive Argentinian in goal is a good strategy, and he may not be able to defend. But there are a few things we do know about this team, which is that they all pass the exact same and they all dribble the exact same. And yet, striker Messi, who's exactly the same as all of his teammates, he gets access to all of these high reward deltas and low risk deltas. Defender Messi gets access to the low reward delta. His passing doesn't really matter, and he gets tortured with the high risk delta. And then, midfield Messi gets nothing, just goes home bored every day. And fundamentally, that's not fair. I don't know what the effect of that is. I don't know how much it biases your stuff, but we know that this must have some sort of effect on the player values you get at the end of the season. And I just don't believe that strikers are the only players that matter. So what we need to do is measure a player's opportunity at the moment they play a ball to actually create value, because this will look different for different players. This is dead easy with tracking data, because you can just look, there's a pass on there, choose one. It's much tougher with event data. And obviously in some models, like the Markov ones, this is really, really clear because you have explicit transition probabilities, which is one of the reasons that those are like really good explainable models. We don't have that because we're dealing with sort of individual sequences and treating them as they are. So what we need to do is find, in historical situations, what were some similar sequences to the one currently underway. And what's the range of values that people historically achieved in those situations? Now, that's not to imply that the same passes are on. If we look in history and you made a forward pass after this dribble, football is dynamic and it's probably completely different. But I'm making the statement that I believe the distribution of values will be slightly more valid doing this than if you just completely ignored the problem. And then basically what you can do is you can say, well, okay, you had access to all of these high-value opportunities, or you had access to all of these low-value opportunities. Instead of just giving you the number, we're going to give you some rank over what we think was available. If all of your options were bad, we're going to give you... you can try Z-scores, but Z-scores are actually kind of bad because you end up with people scoring 5, because like occasionally you'll be in a terrible situation, but you'll whack it into the box and someone will head it, and you'll get weird outside gains. So effectively what you can do is work out percentiles and then maybe just scale it between -1 and 1. But that is a fair way of assigning the reward for the action that you took by giving it the context of everything that happened in similar situations historically. And so, onto another very fashionable subject, autoencoders. So what we want to do is basically find similar possessions. Now, the coolest version of this that I've seen is Joe's, who's at the back of the room, gazing into the latent space. Effectively, what an autoencoder does is a dead simple model where you give it some input and you ask it to give you the exact same output. That's the easiest model in the world to build, right? You just put an equal sign in the middle. I don't know. The trick is, in the middle of a neural network, you squeeze the data down. So you don't just replicate what your input is to your output. That would be stupid. You squeeze it down into this tiny little bottleneck, and you compress it and compress it and compress it while trying to maintain some fidelity between the input and output. And what that gives you is a much more compressed view of the actual underlying meaning of that data. Now, people have traditionally done this with sort of images, input and output. I think part of that's tooling. Again, if you look at like fast AI, it makes this sort of stuff simple. But you lose some of the temporal data because you're effectively just saying this is the geometry of the possession. Now, obviously, it could start here, or it could start here. I know Gary did some work to basically add a gradient. So it starts sort of, well, it ends bright, and then it sort of fades away as time goes down so that the model might learn the temporal outputs. But you don't need to do this. You can literally just explicitly shove the data in, and you can cut and paste the code that you've already got. So you use an LSTM again. So you're feeding in the raw sequences instead of pictures of sequences. You smoosh it down in what's called the latent layer. This is the bottleneck in the middle of the layer that gives you the meaning of the data. And then, so an autoencoder is basically the encoder and then the decoder. And the decoder is the thing that's supposed to recreate the value. And the better it scores, the more accurate you know this representation is. If these look nothing like the input, then this is a rubbish representation. If these look exactly like the input, this is a really good representation. And you smoosh that down to be as small as possible while maintaining a good representation, which relies on some sort of scoring function. If you care just about the geometry, then you will look at, you put a sequence in, you get a sequence out, you'll basically just look at the coordinates and you'll score how close they are. It's likely that you want to go a little bit further than that because there's a little bit more context than just the raw structure. There's things like passes over the top as opposed to straight passes. There's dribbles instead of carries and stuff. So you kind of have to work out what features you think are important. I can't do that for you. One thing that you can do is instead of just using one decoder and one loss function that says the geometry is the same, you can also do something like predict the next event, because if a sequence ends with a high ball, next event is likely to be a header, let's say. If a sequence says like a through ball, next event is likely to be a kicked shot or something. So if you can use multiple decoders and multiple loss functions. We didn't do that in this. But effectively, that'll give you a slightly better recreation of the initial sequence. So just going back, this is what the rewards look like. Overall, obviously, they're centered around 0 because nothing matters, life is meaningless. But you end up with sort of structures like this. So we've got this is k nearest neighbors. This isn't clustering. You can do clustering for this, and I'll mention why you'll want to. But this is what the rewards look like. We've kind of got we're closer to the goal, which is why you've got this big bar here. You have access to some really high rewards and some sort of meaty middle ground here, but also some bad things can happen. So that's kind of what we would expect historically from possessions that look like this. But imagine if you're this person. You've got a little ball recovery here, and then you pass forwards and then a short pass. You only have access to these rewards. Now the middle of this is 0. Middle of this is break even, right? All the options are bad here. You are going to get a negative score. It's going to affect your income. People are going to say you're rubbish on Twitter. What you've got to do, though, is build a model that effectively says, okay, well, all of your options are bad, but did you at least choose, like, the least bad one? Did you at least... I mean, if you get 0 here, if you get break even, you are probably better than, like, 90% of the historical actions taken in these sorts of situations. And the problem is that to do this as k-nearest neighbours, you have to compare millions of sequences to millions of sequences. So you've got all of these vectors that represent sequences, and you've got all of these vectors. It's going to be like really, really slow. Like, you know, heat death of the universe kind of slow on a big data set. You can cut it down because you kind of know what the clustering is going to, what the nearest algorithm is going to do. You can sort of pre-select certain similar sequences based upon where they were on the pitch. You can select them based upon whether they're roughly the similar length. It's very unlikely that a passing move all the way from the box up to the other box is going to be the same as like one snapshot outside the box. Bung it on the GPU because, I don't know, you've got loads of AWS credits again. And like, realistically, if it doesn't get much faster, I will give up and just cluster. But it makes me sad because I kind of feel like if you can do something with the highest level of fidelity, then you should at least try. And if it's a sort of performance issue, then I would really like to attack it. But ultimately, you can just do, you know, k-means clustering of these possessions, and you can just trust that the model's picking up. But again, even if you do something like k-means clustering on possessions, you don't have to just do it with geometrical information. You can weight it, you can put more context in. The distance function on k-means clustering is something nobody ever thinks about. They all just go, it's the Euclidean distance, and all of these attributes are exactly the same importance, and that's not really the case. Anyway, I'm going to talk about like a little hobby project now, because as I say, I get sad that we're basing everything on goals. We've already talked about how there aren't really any. There's not much signal in football, and we build models that make it look like nothing matters. And you know, I have 3 children, so I want hope for the world. So is there some way that we can build models that don't refer to shots or goals at all? Somebody free me. This is Henry II and Thomas à Becket. He made a throwaway comment about not liking goals, and then a knight killed the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's fine, it's history, you don't need to worry about it. So this is my hobby project. Now, I haven't got really far with this, but I've talked about this to people, and it's like, I really hope this works. What is a goal? A goal is when the ball goes just a little bit further and goes over the line. What is not a goal? Anything else. This, to me, seems like pretty much nearly a goal, right? So what if we built models just around the ball going towards the goal? Because what matters? Goals. What's the next best thing than goals? Getting close to goals, right? So getting close but no closer is rubbish. This is a pitfall of this model. So let's say you pass the ball like 75% of the way up the pitch, but then, oh no, it's Burnley, and they've got 11 men behind the ball. You're not scoring today, so maybe that pass wasn't very good. So we can't really use pure ball regression. What we care about is the future ball progression. You start the ball with the keeper, you know you're probably going to work the ball most of the way up the field. Expected ball progression. This is what's next, people. Probably. 200 possessions every game. Every single one gets a certain distance to the goal, right? And that's 200 bits of really important signal. Now, I don't know if you believe this, but I kind of feel like when a team gets the ball 2/3 of the way up the field, that means something. They might not score, but it feels like it means something. I've been at football matches, I've heard people going, whoa, you know, and that's all models are. So each possession has a high water mark. we're throwing something away with this model, obviously, because, well, hang on, it's like the high watermark of that possession means we're talking about turnovers again. And so we're reintroducing problems that we already thought we'd sort of dealt with in other models. But what's nice about this is that the distance kind of persists. So in the example with the kickoff, I kick it out for a throw-in, well, the ball's there. That's where the throw-in's going to be taken from. And also in the case with the expected ball progression numbers is if I chip the ball in and you sort of whack it wildly out, well, a lot of the time I'm going to pick up that ball and it's going to come straight back at you. So actually some of these turnovers don't move the needle much. And so a lot more information persists. And so what you get from that is that you're not really a slave to possessions, or at the very least you can use much sort of shorter, more easily broken possessions. Just to illustrate, like this is one possession in sort of two phases. In the red phase you've got kind of 3 events. And you get pretty close to the goal, but then you go, maybe not. And then recycle possession. So when you're training this, you would effectively be training the first 3 events on the red high watermark. And after that, you would be training the other events on the blue high watermark. So what this gives you is like, you've got suddenly hundreds of interesting points on a continuous scale that you're training a model against, which looks like that. I don't really know why I put that in, but that is what it looks like. And that is so much richer than goals, and it's so much richer than shots. And even if you can't use it for everything that we've talked about today, but like analysing defence and predicting, and you would never be able to put this in a gambling model, sorry, there has to be something useful for build-up play in such a rich signal in the data. And so I refuse to believe that this won't work, and that's all I'm going to work on from now on, which I can say because Ted's doing his panel in the other room. Anyway, admittedly, they're abstract numbers that you can't really communicate. We don't talk about conceding. And again, goals do matter as much as I hate people concentrating on them. Anyway, I've rambled. So one of the nice things is once you've got this sort of k-nearest neighbours clustering model, and you know the range of values that you get off a pass, one of the things that I thought would be really cool is if you look at the player who gets the ball next, if they're constantly receiving the ball in above average value positions, does that mean they have good movement? Does that mean the team has good positioning? There's got to be something around that you can work on. And also just going back to the sort of SARSA version of things, I think it really must matter that different teams have different styles. The rewards in the future are different depending on what team you are. Like, if I make a long ball forwards and I've got a massive number 9 with a huge head, that's got to mean a little bit more on my team than, it's messy. That was pointless. And so you can get a bit more context like that. Anyway, free ideas, please use them. Grab the free data. Thank you.